Tonight we're slipping in through the side gate of a Japanese shrine just before dawn, when the gravel is still cold and silver with dew and the great wooden buildings are holding their breath in the dark. The lanterns haven't been lit yet. Somewhere up in the cryptomeria trees, a crow is clearing its throat like a man about to give a speech nobody asked for. And you, in this story, are the person whose job it is to make this whole sacred machine run before any of the gods, or the visitors, or the head priest are properly awake. You are a miko, a shrine maiden, and your morning has already started whether you like it or not. If a slow wander through other people's centuries is the kind of thing you enjoy falling asleep to, you can quietly like this video and subscribe so the next one finds you. And if you'd tell me in the comments where you are and what the local time is right now, I do love reading where everyone's drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, set your phone aside or face down and turn the brightness all the way down. Good. Let's go back. What did a shrine maiden actually do all day when she wasn't being photographed by tourists? Why were the earliest ones less like gentle ceremonial helpers and more like the only people in the village who could talk to the unseen world? And why did the government one day decide that had to stop? What is in those little wooden-handled bells she waves, and why does the sound matter? How do you sweep a courtyard that is, technically, never finished? What were the fortune slips really for? Who wrote them, and what happened if you got a bad one? Why did a teenage girl in some centuries hold a kind of authority that grown men in the same village did not? And how did one of the oldest spiritual roles in Japan quietly become a part-time job you could pick up over winter break to help pay for university? We'll get to all of it. So, you've just opened your eyes in a small wooden room with paper-screened windows somewhere in Japan. In a year will keep pleasantly vague for now, and the cold air is the first thing that reaches you. There's no heating worth mentioning. There rarely is. You can see your own breath, faintly, hanging in the grey light, and the futon you're lying on is warm in exactly the shape of you and nowhere else, which makes the prospect of leaving it feel like a small personal tragedy. But you get up, because the gods do not observe a snooze button. The first thing to understand about being a miko is that, for a very long stretch of history, the word didn't mean what you probably think it means. Picture the version most people carry in their heads. A serene young woman in a white top and bright red split skirt, sweeping leaves, selling charms, occasionally performing a slow, graceful dance with a bell. Calm, decorative, junior. That's the modern image, and it isn't wrong about today. It's just spectacularly wrong about the beginning. In the oldest layers of Japanese religious life, going back well before the country had a single capital or a settled idea of itself, a miko was something far stranger and far more powerful. She was the one the spirit spoke through, the medium, the voice. When the community needed to know why the rice had failed, or whether to go to war, or what an angry local god wanted in order to stop making everyone ill, they did not consult a book. There was no book. They went to her, and she would enter a trance, and the god would supposedly use her mouth to answer. This was not a side hobby. In a world with no clear line between religion, medicine, government, and weather forecasting, the woman who could speak for the unseen was one of the most important people for miles. Kings and chieftains kept her close. Some of the very earliest powerful figures in Japanese legend are women described in exactly these terms. Rulers who governed through their access to the divine, with a brother or a male official handling the dull administrative parts, while she handled the part where you talk to forces that could end a harvest. Hold that image for a second. The shy girl selling keyrings at the gift counter is descended professionally from someone the entire region was afraid to upset. How you actually entered that trance varied, and the sources get hazy here in ways I'll be honest about rather than pretend otherwise. Drumming, in many cases. Repetition. Dance that went on until the dancer wasn't quite herself anymore. A bell or a branch hung with strips of white paper, held and shaken in a slow rhythm that blurred the edges of ordinary attention. The bow turns up too, the actual hunting kind, its string plucked not to fire anything but to make a single, low, resonant note that was thought to summon a presence and clear the air of bad influence. We'll come back to that bow more than once tonight. It has a long career ahead of it. What mattered was the crossing. The miko made herself into a doorway, and on a good day something came through, and on a bad day she'd spent 3 hours dancing in the cold for a village that still didn't know whether to plant the north field. You, lying in your cold little room, are the inheritor of all of that. Most mornings, admittedly, it expresses itself as sweeping, but the lineage is there, and it's worth keeping in the back of your mind as we go, because almost everything you'll do today is a tamed, tidied, government-approved descendant of something that was once genuinely wild. The crow outside has now been joined by a second crow. They appear to be arguing. This is also part of the lineage, though no shrine will admit it. Let's deal with the clothes, because you have to put them on, and the visitors are going to ask about them later anyway, usually while pretending they're not. The white upper garment goes on first. White, in this world, is not a fashion choice. It's the colour of purity, of the clean and the sacred and the not yet touched, and it's doing real symbolic work every second you wear it. The cut is loose and plain, designed for movement and for modesty and absolutely not for warmth, which you will be reminded of all winter. Then the red, the long divided skirt, pleated and wide, that you step into and tie high. It's a deep vermilion, the colour of certain temple gates and certain sunsets, and not coincidentally a colour long believed to push back illness and bad fortune. There's a practical theory too, the kind historians offer with a slight shrug. Red dye, vermilion in particular, was associated with warding off decay, and a colour that keeps rot away from a wooden building is a colour worth putting on the people who tend it. Whether anyone in the early days reasoned it out that cleanly is a fair question, but the red stuck, and the contrast of white over red became one of the most recognisable silhouettes in the entire culture. You tie it carefully. A loose one comes undone mid-dance, and there are few things less divine than a sacred performer hitching up her skirt in front of 300 New Year visitors. Your hair gets pulled back and bound, often with a strip of white paper folded around it, sometimes with a longer fall of red and white cord depending on the day and the shrine and how formal things are about to get. The overall effect, once you're fully assembled, is striking and clean and just slightly out of time, like a figure that stepped out of an old painting and is now, regrettably, going to have to go and deal with the recycling. Because here is the part the paintings leave out. You are a sacred vessel, a living link to centuries of the holy and the unseen, and your first genuine task of the day is cleaning. Lots of it. The divine, it turns out, generates a truly heroic amount of housework. The sweeping deserves its own moment, because it is going to eat more of your life than any single other thing, and because if you understand the sweeping, you understand the whole strange logic of the place. You step out into the main precinct with a broom. Not a charming little prop broom, a real one, long-handled, the bristles made of bound twigs or bamboo, heavy and slightly awkward, the kind of tool that lets you know after 20 minutes exactly which muscles in your back you'd been ignoring. And you begin to sweep the gravel. Now, a reasonable person, a modern person, sweeps in order to finish. You sweep the floor so that the floor is clean, and then you stop, because the goal was clean floor, and you have achieved clean floor. Congratulations. That is not what is happening here. The sweeping of a shrine is not really about removing dirt, though it does that too. It's a form of purification, an act with a spiritual weight equal to a prayer, and like a prayer it isn't something you complete and tick off. The leaves will fall again. The dust will come back on the wind off the mountain. Tomorrow there will be more, and you will sweep again, and this is not a failure of the system, it is the system. You're not cleaning the courtyard so much as continuously participating in its cleanliness, which is a very different relationship with a broom than most people ever have. There's a famous idea woven through a lot of Japanese spiritual practice that the doing is the point, that the repeated humble act done with full attention is itself the devotion. The swept gravel is the visible proof of an invisible care. A guest walks in, sees the raked stones and the absence of yesterday's leaves, and feels, without quite knowing why, that this is a place that is looked after. That feeling is your work. You made that. With a broom, in the cold, before they were awake. It's also frankly freezing, and your hands have gone the kind of red that no symbolic skirt can take credit for. The crows are watching you from the roofline with the smug expression of creatures who have never once had to tidy anything. You rake the gravel into its long, clean lines, you gather the leaves, and somewhere around the far corner, near the old stone basin, you notice the cat. There is always a cat. We'll get to the cat. Before any visitor is allowed near the gods, and before you are either, there is the matter of water. Near the entrance to almost every shrine sits a basin, often stone, often fed by a bamboo pipe that lets a thin, cold ribbon of water fall endlessly into it, with a sound that is, even now, one of the most quietly pleasant noises a human can stand next to. Beside it, a row of long-handled wooden dippers. This is where purification begins for everyone who enters, and as a miko you both perform the rinsing yourself and, in a sense, stand as a guardian of the whole idea of it. The ritual is small and precise and older than almost anything you own. You take the dipper in one hand, fill it once, and that single scoop of water has to do everything. You rinse the left hand, then the right. Then you pour a little into a cupped palm to rinse the mouth, quietly, never touching your lips to the dipper itself, because dozens of strangers will use it after you, and the water is sacred, but it is not, let's be reasonable, magic. Then you tip the dipper upright to let the last of the water run back down the handle, and clean it for the next person, and you set it back exactly as you found it. 1 scoop, 4 actions, no waste. It's a tiny masterpiece of design, and you'll watch tourists fumble it for the rest of your life. Half of them convinced it's a drinking fountain, and you will learn to correct them with a gentleness that costs you something. The water itself matters enormously in this religion, more than almost any single substance. Cold running water is purity in physical form. Waterfalls are sacred. The act of rinsing away the unclean, the spiritually dusty, the residue of ordinary contact with the ordinary world is the doorstep you cross to approach anything holy. You'll do versions of this purification all day, on yourself, on objects, on spaces, sometimes with water and sometimes with salt and sometimes with a wand of paper streamers shaken over the thing to be cleansed. That wand, by the way, the wooden stick hung with folded white paper that you'll see priests sweep through the air, is going to become very familiar to your wrists. It looks effortless when done well. It is not. There is a correct way to hold it, a correct arc, a correct rhythm, and your early attempts will look less like a sacred cleansing and more like someone shooing an invisible wasp. You'll get there. Everyone does. The wasp shooing phase is simply part of the training, and no one who has done this job will ever admit to you how long theirs lasted. The water keeps falling into the basin with its small, endless music. The light is coming up properly now, grey going to gold at the edges, and somewhere inside the main hall, a bell needs ringing, because it is nearly time to wake the god. Inside the main hall, in the dim, before the lamps are properly lit, hangs a great bell, or sometimes a coiled rope of thick twisted cloth that visitors will later pull to sound a clapper. or in the grander shrines a heavy suspended drum. The arrangement varies, and I'd rather tell you it varies than pretend every shrine in 1,000 years of history kept identical furniture. But the principle holds steady across all of them. You make a sound to mark the threshold between the ordinary and the divine, and the sound is not decoration. It's an announcement. It says, attention is being paid now. Something is about to begin. You ring it or strike it, and the note rolls out into the cold and fades, and in that fading there's a held quality, a sense of the air itself going still and formal. The god is understood to dwell here, in the inner sanctuary, behind doors that you, a junior miko, will almost certainly never be permitted to open. Few people are. The most sacred object of the shrine, the thing in which the deity is said to settle, often sits in a box that has not been opened in living memory, wrapped in cloth, inside another box inside a room nobody enters. Some of these objects have not been looked at by human eyes in centuries. The mystery is the point. A god you can stroll up and inspect is not doing its job, so your relationship with the deity is, by design, slightly indirect. You serve a presence you don't see. You prepare a meal for someone who will never appear at the table, and yet the whole rhythm of the morning bends around that presence as if it were a demanding house guest, which, in a sense, it is, because the god has to be fed. We'll get to breakfast. But understand the shape of it first. You're about to cook for a being whose appetite you can never confirm, whose reviews never come, and whose plate, when you collect it later, will look exactly as full as when you set it down. And you will do this every single day, with full sincerity, and somehow it will not feel absurd. That's the strange alchemy of the place. After a week, you stop noticing. After a month, you'd feel uneasy skipping it. The lamps are lit now, the shrine is awake, and the kitchen, of all places, is where the sacred day truly gets going. The food offering has a name and a whole quiet discipline around it, and it is far more involved than tipping some rice into a dish and calling the deity to dinner. The meal laid before a god is meant to be pure, fresh, and prepared with a level of attention that would make a high-end restaurant nervous. Rice, first and always. Rice is the centre of gravity of the entire culture, the crop the calendar bends around, the thing whose success or failure once decided whether a village ate or didn't, so of course it sits at the heart of what you offer. Then water, clean and cold, salt, rice wine, the clear ceremonial kind, and then, depending on the day and the season, and the shrine's traditions, vegetables, fruit, sometimes something from the sea, sometimes seaweed, arranged on plain unglazed vessels of wood or pottery that are themselves kept ritually clean and used for nothing else. The arranging is its own art. There's an order, a geometry, a correct height and placement, and you learn it by watching and by being gently corrected roughly 400 times. The offerings are carried to the deity in a slow, careful procession, presented, left for the god to take their fill of in whatever invisible manner gods do that, and then later withdrawn with the same care. And here's the part that delights me, quietly, every time. Afterward the food doesn't go to waste. It's shared and eaten by the shrine staff, by you, in a practice that treats the leftovers as blessed by contact with the divine. The god takes the essence, you get the actual lunch. It's a beautifully practical theology. The unseen guest is honoured, the rice is not thrown out, and everyone agrees not to examine the logistics too closely. You will eat a great deal of consecrated rice in this job, and after the first hungry winter you will stop finding it funny and start finding it sensible. You carry the trays. Your hands are steady now, or steadier. You've learned not to let the wide sleeves of the white garment drag across the offerings, a lesson everyone learns the same embarrassing way. And as you set the rice down in the dim and bow and withdraw, walking backward the prescribed number of steps because you do not turn your back on a god any more than you turn it on a visiting empress. You might catch, low and unbothered at the edge of the hall, 2 green eyes watching the fish. The cat has opinions about the fish offering. The cat has always had opinions about the fish offering. No one has ever successfully explained to the cat that it is for the deity, and frankly no one has tried very hard because a shrine cat is widely held to be lucky, and a lucky animal that steals from the gods occupies a theological grey area nobody wants to litigate before breakfast. You shoo it gently. It does not move so much as relocate its contempt to a slightly sunnier spot, and the offering, this time, survives. Now, about the dancing, because this is the part that the trance medium past flows directly into, and it's one of the loveliest threads in the whole story. The sacred dance is called kagura, and at its root the word carries the sense of a seat, or a place where the gods are entertained, a performance staged to please and to summon the divine. This is the tamed, refined, breathtakingly beautiful descendant of those wild old trances we talked about at the start, where the ancient medium danced until the god rode her into speech. The miko of later centuries dances a slow, controlled, exquisitely formal piece, fully herself the whole time, offering the movement up rather than dissolving into it. You hold a fan, or a wand of bells, or a spray of leaves from the sacred evergreen tree, depending on the dance. The bells are a cluster of small round metal bells on a handle, arranged in tiers, and when you turn your wrist just so they give a bright shivering sound that is by old belief purifying in itself. The dance is unhurried almost to the point of stillness, a step, a turn, the slow lift of an arm, the bells, then quiet, another step. To an outside eye it can look like very little is happening, and that's exactly the skill, because holding that much stillness and grace and control while 300 people watch and your knees quietly file a complaint is far harder than thrashing about would ever be. There's an origin story underneath all of this, and it's one of the most beloved in the whole religion, so let me lay it down gently while you're warm. The sun deity, the great radiant goddess from whom the whole imperial line is said to descend, once took offence at her brother's appalling behaviour and shut herself away inside a cave, sealing the entrance with a boulder. And with the sun hidden, the world went dark. Crops failed. The other gods panicked, and the thing that finally coaxed her out was a dance. Another goddess performed a wild, funny foot-stamping dance on an overturned tub outside the cave, and the assembled gods roared with laughter, and the sun goddess, unable to bear missing whatever was so funny, peeked out, and the light came back into the world. So the very first dance, in the mythology, was a performance that lured the light back out of hiding. Every kagura you dance is a faint echo of that. You, turning slowly with your bells in the cold morning, are reenacting the moment the world got the sun back. Most days it won't feel that grand. Your feet will be cold and you'll be counting steps. But it's there underneath, that origin, and on the rare morning when the timing's perfect and the bells ring clean and the low sun comes through the trees at exactly the right slant, you'll feel the edge of it. The very old idea that a woman dancing well can call light into a dark place. Then the dance ends, and you bow, and you go and help an elderly visitor who has dropped her fortune slip into the water basin and is quietly distraught about it. The sacred and the mundane share a calendar here. They always have. Let's talk about those fortune slips, because they are one of the small engines that keep the whole place running, and because the history of them is funnier and stranger than most people selling them today realise. A visitor approaches a counter, often staffed by you, and for a small offering receives a folded paper slip telling them their fortune. Great blessing. Good fortune. Middling. Small misfortune. The grades run up and down a scale, and the slip goes on to comment on specific corners of the person's life. their health, their studies, a hoped-for journey, a romance they haven't mentioned to anyone but are clearly thinking about, money, a lost item, the right direction to travel. People take these extremely seriously, and also not seriously at all, both at once, in the way humans tend to treat fortune-telling when they're enjoying it. The slips themselves descend from much older and weightier methods of asking the unseen for guidance. Long ago, drawing lots to determine the will of the gods was a solemn business, used for choosing among serious options when no human had the standing to decide. Which candidate, which date, which course of action. The gods were thought to nudge the draw. Over the centuries, this solemn practice softened and democratized and turned, eventually, into the cheerful paper lottery a teenager buys for pocket change on a day out. The line from one to the other is unbroken. You're running, essentially, a 1,000-year-old oracle that has been gently rebranded for the gift shop era. And here's the lovely bit of practical theology built into the system. If you draw a bad fortune, you're not stuck with it. You fold the slip and tie it to a designated rack or a tree branch within the shrine grounds, leaving the misfortune behind, attached to the sacred place, where the gods can dilute it, or where it can simply stay put while you walk away unburdened. Whole sections of trees and string frames near the counter flutter white, with hundreds of tied-up bad luck slips, a snowfall of other people's small dreaded futures left in your care. That, technically, is now your problem, not the futures themselves, the clean-up. Because old slips have to be gathered and respectfully dealt with, and the rack fills faster than you'd think, and somewhere in your second week you'll find yourself holding 100 strangers' worst-case scenarios in a basket, on your way to dispose of them properly, thinking thoughts no ancient shamaness ever had to think. The cat watches you carry the basket. The cat, as far as anyone can tell, has never once drawn a bad fortune in its life. The amulets are next, and they live one counter over from the fortunes, and the two of them together are most of why a shrine can keep its roof in good repair. Spread across the counter in front of you are the charms. Small cloth pouches, usually brocade, brightly coloured, each one stitched shut around a little slip of wood or paper inside that carries the blessing. You're forbidden, and so is the buyer, from opening them. Opening one lets the protection out, or at least lets the mystery out, which amounts to the same thing commercially. Each charm is aimed at a particular worry, one for safe travel, one for success in study, which sells in absolute torrents the week before exams, bought by anxious students and even more anxious mothers of students, one for health, one for a safe birth, one for finding love, bought with a studied casualness by people who are fooling no one for warding off general misfortune, the broad spectrum option for those who aren't sure what's coming but would prefer it didn't. Your job at this counter is part shopkeeper, part priestess, part unlicensed therapist. People tell you things, they don't mean to. But there's something about buying a small blessing for a sick parent that loosens the tongue, and you will hear, across enough mornings, a quiet, rolling census of an entire community's fears. The exam they're dreading, the pregnancy they're frightened for, the trip a son is taking somewhere far away. You hand over the right charm, you bow, you say the gentle expected words, and you carry none of it home, or you try not to. And mostly you fail because you're a person and not a vending machine, however much the formality of the role would like you to be one. The charms have a shelf life, by the way, which surprises outsiders. The standard belief is that a protective charm does its work for about a year, soaking up the bad fortune it was meant to deflect, and then it's spent, and the right thing to do is bring it back to a shrine to be respectfully retired and replaced with a fresh one. Cynics call this a subscription model with a 1,000-year head start, and they're not entirely wrong, but the deeper logic is sincere. The charm took the hit so you didn't, and now it's full, and you thank it and let it go. There's a tenderness in that idea that survives even the most commercial counter. You'll retire a great many spent charms over a year. They come back in their hundreds after the new year especially, dropped into collection boxes, and they're gathered and purified and respectfully sent on with fire in a special rite. The smoke carrying a year of absorbed misfortune up and away from everyone will get to the fire. The fire is one of the great nights of the calendar. But that's still some months off, and right now it's an ordinary morning, and a man is asking you with enormous seriousness whether you have a charm specifically for passing a driving test. You do, more or less. There's a travel safety one that covers it. He buys 2. You decide not to ask why 2. Some questions are not yours to pull on. Let's pull back from the counter and look at the place itself, because you live and work inside a structure of rank that shapes every hour of your day, and the miko sits in a very particular spot within it. At the top of a shrine sits the head priest, almost always a man, the chief officiant, the one who performs the most sacred rites and represents the shrine to the outside world. Below him, depending on the size of the place, a range of other priests of descending rank, each with their robes and their duties and their carefully observed precedents. The colours and patterns of the robes signal rank with a precision that takes years to fully read. A glance tells the initiated exactly who outranks whom, the way a military uniform does. There are assistants, caretakers, people who handle the accounts, because a shrine of any size is also unavoidably a small business and a landholder and an employer, and someone has to do the dull terrestrial parts while everyone else attends to the eternal. And then there's you, the miko. In the modern arrangement, junior, assisting, often young, often there, only a few years before life moves you along. You're not, in this later structure, a priest. You cannot perform the highest rites. There's a ceiling above you, and for most of recent history it has been firmly in place. And we should be honest that this is a real limitation and not just a charming quirk of tradition. But here's where the story doubles back on itself in a way I find quietly remarkable. That ceiling is recent. For most of the deep history we started with, the woman in this role wasn't beneath the male priest in some tidy hierarchy. She was the irreplaceable one, the channel, the voice, the thing the male officials arranged themselves around. The administrative man handling the boring parts while the woman handled the divine wasn't a sign of her low status. It was a sign of her high one. She did the thing that mattered. He did the paperwork. What happened in between, the long slow shift from sacred medium to ceremonial assistant, is one of the central threads of this whole topic, and it didn't happen by accident. And it didn't happen gently. A government did it, fairly deliberately, in a fairly compressed window of time, for reasons that had very little to do with the gods, and a great deal to do with power. We'll come to that. It's a heavier section than most, and I'll keep it soft, but it's worth staying awake for. Or rather, it's worth letting it carry you down, because it explains how the wild shamaness of the opening became the gentle figure at the charm counter. For now, hold the shape of it. You sit near the bottom of a ladder that your distant predecessors didn't have to climb, because they were already standing at the top of a different one entirely. History took something away here. It also, in fairness, gave the role a quiet durability that the powerful version might never have had. The powerful get toppled. The humble get to keep showing up with a broom for 1,000 years. The head priest passes you in the corridor and gives a small nod. You bow rather lower. The choreography of rank is constant and mostly unspoken, and you've stopped noticing you're doing it. The training to get here is worth sitting with, because outsiders imagine it's all spiritual instruction and serene mentorship, and it is partly that, but it's also a startling amount of extremely specific physical drilling. How to bow. Not vaguely, not approximately, but to precise depths for precise occasions, the angle of a greeting versus the deeper angle of reverence versus the deepest reserved for the most sacred moments, each one a different fold of the body held for a different count. How to walk, the pace, the posture, the particular sliding step used in formal ritual space, where you do not stride like a person late for a train, but move as though the floor itself deserves consideration. How to hold your hands when not using them, folded just so. How to sit on your heels for long stretches without your face betraying the slow rebellion of your legs. How to turn. How to carry an offering tray at exactly the right height. How to kneel and rise without a wobble in clothing specifically designed to make wobbling likely. It is, in a real sense, a physical apprenticeship in stillness and grace, and it is much harder than it looks, which is rather the whole point. The grace has to look effortless, and effortlessness is the most expensive thing there is to fake. Every serene gesture you'll make at a festival is built on weeks of correction, of an older miko or a senior staff member, quietly resetting the angle of your wrist for the 100th time, of practicing a single 12-second sequence until it stops looking like a sequence and starts looking like nature. And the bells. The wand of bells used in the dance demands its own long study. There's a right rhythm to the shake, a right height, a way of turning the wrist that makes the sound bloom cleanly rather than clatter. In your early weeks, the bells will sound frankly like a startled goat. You'll be acutely aware of this. The senior miko will say nothing, which is somehow worse than if she said something, and you'll practice alone in a cold side room until the clatter resolves, one day, without warning, into a clean, bright shiver, and you'll look up to see if anyone noticed, and no one will have, and that anticlimax is also part of the training. There's no certificate at the end of any of this traditionally, no graduation. You simply become, by accumulation of corrected small motions, someone who moves correctly in a sacred space. And then one ordinary morning you'll catch a brand new miko making your old mistakes, the startled goat bells, the wobble on rising, and you'll feel a strange tender vertigo at how far you've quietly come, without anyone ever telling you that you'd arrived. The cat, who has watched a dozen miko arrive as startled goats and leave as graceful professionals, remains entirely unimpressed by any of it. The cat was born knowing how to move beautifully. The cat finds your whole apprenticeship faintly comic. The bow turns up again now, the actual archery kind, and I promised it would, so let's give it its proper section, because the rituals built around it are some of the most striking things you'll witness. Long before it became a quiet symbol shaken to summon spirits, the bow was a weapon, and a weapon that could send something flying a great distance carried obvious awe. Out of that grew a whole family of ritual practices in which the bow purifies, protects, and drives away the unwanted. In one rite performed at certain shrines, particularly around the New Year, an archer looses arrows toward a great target marked with a symbol, and the act is understood to scatter misfortune for the coming year, to clear the air of bad influence in every direction the arrows fly. The crowd watches in the cold, the bowstring sings, the arrow flies, and a year's worth of bad luck is ceremonially sent packing. There's a related ritual that's purer sound than spectacle, where the bowstring is plucked sharply without any arrow at all, the bare note ringing out to cleanse a space and ward off ill influence. This is the direct descendant of those ancient summonings we touched on at the start. The low resonant string note that was thought to call a presence and clear the air. The same physical act, the same sound carried forward across centuries, its meaning slowly shifting from summoning to purifying, the way meanings do when they travel far enough. As a miko, you may not be the one drawing the bow at the Grand New Year rite. Depending on the shrine and the century, that's often a role for priests or for honoured archers brought in for the occasion. But you'll be threaded all through the surrounding ceremony, carrying, preparing, purifying, dancing, present at the edges of the spectacle, doing the quieter sacred work that makes the loud sacred work possible. And you'll come to know the sound of that bowstring intimately, the way it cuts cleanly through cold air, the small collective intake of breath in the watching crowd just before it's loosed. There's a decorative arrow too, sold around the new year, a beautiful ornamental thing with white feather fletching, meant to be taken home and kept through the year to ward off misfortune and bad influence from the household. People buy them in great numbers, carry them home reverently, prop them somewhere auspicious, and bring them back a year later to be retired by fire with everything else. You'll sell a great many of these, wrapping each one, handing it across the counter to someone who wants, very simply, for the coming year to go better than the last one. It's hard not to be moved by that, hour after hour. The whole enterprise, under all the ritual, is just people hoping. People hoping, and you handing them an arrow to hang their hope on. Snow has started lightly, while you weren't watching. The first of the season. It settles on the swept gravel you cleaned at dawn, undoing your work with complete indifference, and you'll sweep it again, and that's fine, because by now you understand that the sweeping was never going to be finished, and that the not finishing was always the whole quiet point. The seasons run the shrine far more than any priest does, and now that the first snow has arrived, you're standing at the edge of the busiest stretch of the entire year, so let's walk into it slowly, because it's about to stop being a quiet life for a while. A shrine breathes with the calendar. There are long sleepy weeks where the precinct is nearly empty, where you sweep and sell the occasional charm and watch the cat patrol its territory, and the loudest thing all day is the water in the basin. And then there are the festival days, the seasonal peaks, when the whole place fills and roars and you barely sit down from before dawn until well after the lamps come on. The rhythm isn't even. It was never meant to be. It follows the old agricultural year, the planting and the harvest and the turning points of the season, because this religion grew up out of rice farming and never really left the field, whatever city it now finds itself in. In spring there are rites to ask for a good growing year, to bless the seeds and the soil and the labour about to begin. In autumn there are rites of thanks, the harvest brought in, the gods offered the first and best of it. Midsummer brings festivals to push back illness, which spread fastest in the heat, with great purification rituals where people pass through a woven ring of grass to leave their accumulated impurity behind. There are days devoted to children, when families bring their small ones in their best clothes to be blessed at particular ages, and you'll spend those days surrounded by overwhelmed 3-year-olds in tiny formal robes, some delighted, most appalled, all of them photographed within an inch of their lives. Each of these is a working day for you of a particular flavour. The child blessing days are charming and exhausting and slightly sticky. The harvest days smell of fruit and rice wine. The summer purification days are sweltering under all that white cloth. And looming over the whole calendar, the great mountain that the entire year climbs toward, is the new year, which at a shrine is not a single evening but a tidal event, and which is coming for you now, with the snow. You feel it gathering before it arrives, extra hands are brought in, stock is laid up. The senior staff acquire a particular braced expression, and you, watching the charms pile up in their boxes and the fortune slips stacked in their hundreds, begin to understand that the quiet contemplative life you signed up for is about to become, for roughly 3 days, something closer to running a sacred railway station at rush hour, in a snowstorm, with everyone present hoping very hard for a better year. But that's still a few weeks out. For now, the snow falls on the empty courtyard, and you have the rare gift of a slow afternoon, and you spend part of it doing something that surprises visitors when they learn of it. You're learning to write. The brush and the writing deserve their own quiet hour, because a great deal of what a shrine produces is, at bottom, beautiful handwriting, and somebody has to make it, and increasingly that somebody is you. There's a tradition of inscribing things by hand here that runs deep. The wooden plaques people buy and write their wishes on and hang up in their flocking hundreds. The formal documents, the labels, the notices, the inscriptions on this and that. And above all, in the modern era, the practice where a visitor brings a special book and receives, in elegant brushwork, a handwritten record of their visit, the shrine's name rendered in flowing characters with a vermilion seal pressed beside it. A thing people travel the country collecting, book after book, shrine after shrine, like the most patient stamp collection in the world. Producing that brushwork well takes real skill, and so you practice. You sit with the brush and the black ink and the paper in the cold side room, and you make the same characters over and over, and at first they are, to put it kindly, enthusiastic. The brush does not forgive. It records every hesitation, every wobble, every moment your wrist tensed when it should have flowed. A confident clean stroke and a nervous shaky one look completely different on the page, and the brush will tell on you every time mercilessly in front of no one but yourself. But slowly the hand learns, the characters settle, the strokes start to have that quality good brushwork has, where a line looks alive, where it seems to move even though it's holding perfectly still. And there's a meditative pull to it, a quiet that descends while you work, the ink and the paper and the single character and nothing else, the cold room forgotten, the busy season forgotten, the whole clamouring calendar reduced to one black stroke laid down well or badly on white. It's some of the most peaceful time the job offers, and it's no accident that it feels close to prayer, because in this tradition, a thing done with full attention and care is prayer, whether it's a swept courtyard or a single brushed line. You'll get good enough eventually to handle the real books, to take a stranger's collection and add your shrine's mark to it in your own hand, and the first time someone bows in thanks for brushwork you made, you'll feel an absurd, disproportionate glow, because they're thanking your wrist for 1,000 cold afternoons of practice they'll never know about. The cat sits on the warm spot by the brazier while you write, supervising, occasionally extending one paw toward the ink, in a way that has ended at least one practice sheet in disaster. You've learned to write with the cat factored in. Everyone here learns to factor in the cat eventually. It is less a pet than a small third condition of employment. For most of the long history we've been tracing, the miko's world was sprawling and varied and only loosely organised. There were the shrine miko, attached to a particular sacred place, doing the dances and the rites, but there were also wandering miko, women who travelled the country, who told fortunes, who acted as mediums for the recently past, who carried messages between the living and those no longer living, who performed at the edges of villages and at crossroads and in the homes of grieving families. These travelling spiritual women were everywhere, woven into ordinary life, consulted in private grief and private hope, across the whole sweep of the country, doing work that was intimate and unofficial and entirely outside any institution. Then came a great national reordering, a deliberate top-to-bottom remaking of the country in a compressed and dramatic window, when Japan, facing the wider world, decided to modernize itself at tremendous speed and to centralize power and to build a unified state with the divine emperor at its head. And in that reordering, the old loose spiritual landscape became a problem to be solved. The new authorities wanted religion organized, regulated, official, useful to the state. The wandering medium, the unlicensed woman speaking for the unseen at crossroads, fit nowhere in that vision. She was uncontrolled. She answered to no shrine, no ministry, no rank. So she was, in effect, banned. The practices of spirit mediumship that had been the very heart of the role for 1,000 years were outlawed, or driven to the margins, branded as superstition unfit for a modern state. The wandering miko largely vanished from open life, and the miko who remained, the shrine miko, were redefined into something safe and ceremonial and clearly subordinate to the priesthood. The dancer, the assistant, the seller of charms, the gentle figure we recognize today. The wildness was legislated out. The voice that spoke for the gods was, by decree, asked to lower itself to a respectful murmur. I want to be careful and honest here, because history doesn't run in a clean villain's plot. The reformers weren't cartoons. They were people trying to drag a country through an impossible transformation at frightening speed, and a great deal of what they built endures and works. But something real was lost in that compression, an ancient form of women's spiritual authority, a tradition of female voices carrying weight in the unseen world, narrowed down and tidied away. The serene shrine maiden of the modern postcard is in part the ghost of a much more powerful figure who was asked firmly to sit down, and yet she didn't disappear. That's the thing to hold on to as the snow falls. The role bent and survived and kept showing up century into century, broom in hand. The powerful version was toppled, the humble version endured. There's a quiet, stubborn dignity in that, and you, standing in your white and red in the falling snow, are the proof of it still walking around. Let's lift back up gently, because the heavy part is past, and turn to something lighter and stranger, the persistent, slightly awkward question of who, exactly, is allowed to do this job and what's expected of the person who does. For a long stretch, there were quiet rules around the purity of the miko, expectations about her being young and unmarried, ideas about ritual cleanliness that placed real constraints on her life. Some of these rules were tied to old, frankly unfair beliefs about purity and the female body that don't bear close examination by modern lights, and I'll name that plainly rather than dress it up. The role came with conditions the priest's roles didn't, conditions that assumed the miko would be a particular kind of person, at a particular stage of life, and would move on from it before long. This is part of why the modern miko is so often young and temporary. The structure was built around impermanence, around a few short years of service rather than a lifetime. That's also oddly part of how the role survived into the present in such a healthy state. Because it became a few years' work rather than a whole life's vocation, it stayed open, refreshable, able to draw in new young women generation after generation without requiring anyone to give up everything for it. In the modern day, an enormous proportion of miko are students, working part-time, especially around the New Year crush when shrines need every hand they can get. A university student might pull on the white and red for the busy season, learn the bows and the bells and the counter, earn some money over the winter break, and carry the experience the rest of her life as a strange, beautiful thing she once did. The sacred role of the ancient shamaness has become, among other things, a really good seasonal job with an unbeatable origin story. And there's something I find lovely in that, rather than diminishing. The continuity runs through these ordinary modern young women now. The student counting change at the charm counter on a freezing December morning is standing exactly where the trance medium stood, where the dancer stood, where the wandering fortune teller stood, doing a softened version of the same work, keeping the thread unbroken without necessarily thinking of it that way. She might be studying engineering. She might have an exam in January. And for a few weeks she's also the latest in a line 1,000 years long, waving the bells, sweeping the gravel, telling a nervous stranger that yes, this charm is the right one for a driving test. The cat naturally does not distinguish between an ancient shamaness and a part-time engineering student. To the cat, all miko are simply the warm-handed beings who control access to the fish offering, and have done for 1,000 years, and will presumably continue to forever. The cat's theology is simple and consistent and entirely about lunch. There's a great deal to be said for it. The new year arrives now and there's no easing into it, because that's not how it arrives for you. So let it wash over the next stretch the way it washes over the shrine, all at once in the cold and the dark, with more people than you have ever seen in one place hoping the same hope at the same time. It begins before midnight on the last night of the old year. The precinct you swept alone at dawn for months is now packed, shoulder to shoulder, a slow river of people in winter coats funneling in through the great gate under the lanterns, their breath rising in one great collective cloud into the freezing air. They have come for the first shrine visit of the new year, the single most important visit any of them will make, the one that sets the tone for everything to follow. They come in their millions across the whole country on these few days. At your shrine, however large or small, they come in numbers that turn the familiar quiet space into something you barely recognize. And you are working. You've probably not slept properly. The charm counter is a wall of reaching hands and offered coins, and you're moving faster than the contemplative ideal of your role ever suggested, handing over charm after charm, arrow after arrow, fortune after fortune, bowing, thanking, making change, your breath clouding, your fingers stiff, the bells of the great rope clanging almost continuously as person after person steps up to make their wish. The line for the main hall stretches back out of the gate and down the road into the dark. The food stalls along the approach send up smoke and the smell of grilled things and sweet things. Children half asleep are carried on shoulders. Old people lean on younger arms. The whole community, the whole shape of human hope is passing through your hands in one long cold blur. It is exhausting in a way that's difficult to convey, and exhilarating in exactly the same measure. Somewhere past the deepest cold of the night, in the strange floating clarity of being far too tired, you'll look up from the counter at the sea of faces, every one of them lit with the same simple wish for the year to be kind, and you'll feel the full weight of what the place is for. Not the rituals as objects, the hope underneath them. You're standing at the exact point where a whole people brings its hope to be witnessed, and your cold hands are part of the machinery of that, and it's overwhelming. Quietly, in the good way. Then a child drops a coin, and the moment passes, and you're back to making change. The sacred and the mundane share a counter here. They always have. The fire comes a little after the new year, and I promised you the fire, and it is one of the most beautiful nights in the whole calendar, so let it glow at the edge of your sleep for a while. Once the new year has turned and the visits have thinned, the shrine gathers up everything spent. All the old charms brought back to be retired, the decorative arrows from last year, the wooden wish plaques, the New Year decorations the whole town took down from their doorways, the fortune slips. A year of absorbed misfortune and expired blessings, collected in great heaps, and on an appointed day it is all given to a great ceremonial fire in the precinct. The flames go up tall in the cold. People gather around in the dark, their faces lit orange, and there's a warmth to it that's physical and something else at once. A year of bad fortune, soaked up by all those charms and slips and arrows, is released upward in the smoke and carried away, up past the bare winter trees, up into the night, gone. People warm their hands. Some bring the year's decorations from home specifically to add to it, to send their own household's old year up with everyone else's. The whole town's accumulated misfortune lifts off together in one column of smoke, and the year is cleanly, properly begun. You tend the edges of this, feeding the fire its endless paper, keeping it controlled, watching 1,000 strangers' wishes and worries turn to light and lift away. It's hypnotic. The cold at your back, the heat on your face, the slow updraft of sparks, the quiet crowd. After the frantic crush of the New Year nights, the fire is a kind of release for you too, the season's pressure lifting with the smoke. You stand and watch it, and feel the year turn over properly inside you, the way it's supposed to. There's an old warmth in fire that runs underneath all of this, older than the shrine, older than the religion, the simple animal comfort of standing in a circle of people around a flame in the deep cold of winter while the dark presses in around you. The ritual gives it meaning, but the comfort was always there first. You feel both at once, the ancient and the immediate, the year's misfortune leaving and the simple heat on your cold cheeks, and it's one of the rare moments where the whole strange job resolves into something perfectly, wordlessly clear. The cat, who has strong feelings about the fire, watches from a safe and disapproving distance, convinced as ever that the entire production is somehow being staged at the expense of its own comfort. The cat tolerates winter. The cat does not endorse it. Weddings happen here too, and they're a softer, smaller, more private kind of working day. So let's step out of the great public crush into one quiet ceremony, the kind that fills an ordinary afternoon. A shrine wedding is an intimate thing compared to the New Year tide. A couple, their close families, the priest, and you. The couple arrive in formal traditional dress, the kind that takes assistance and an hour to put on properly, layered and elaborate and heavy. The bride in particular carrying what amounts to a small architectural achievement of cloth. The ceremony is quiet and slow and deeply formal, conducted in the inner space of the shrine before the deity, words spoken that most of the guests can barely follow, because they are in an old and elevated register, the meaning carried as much by the gravity of it as by the words themselves. Your part is to assist, to move with that trained grace through the small ritual actions, and above all, often, to serve the sacred rice wine in the central rite, where the couple drink together to seal their bond. 3 cups, sipped in a prescribed pattern, the shared drink that joins 2 families. You pour with steady hands, the same steady hands you trained for 1,000 cold mornings, and there's a lovely closing of a circle in it. The same wine you offer to the unseen God each morning, now poured for 2 visible nervous people promising each other a life. The sacred and the human sharing 1 cup. These are tender days to work. The nervousness in the room, the pride in the parents' faces, the particular stiff carefulness of 2 people in unfamiliar formal clothes, trying very hard not to make a mistake on the most watched afternoon of their lives. You've seen enough of them now to read the small signs, the bride's hands not quite steady, the groom over-rehearsing the cup, a mother quietly overcome at the back. You hold the formal frame around all that human feeling, steady and graceful, so the couple can simply be inside their moment without having to manage it. That's the gift of the trained role in the end. Your years of practice stillness exist so that other people, on the big days of their lives, don't have to think about the mechanics and can just feel what they came to feel. Afterward there are photographs in the precinct. The couple posed against the great gate, against the snow if there's snow, the bride's elaborate dress vivid against the dark wood, and you slip back out of the frame, back to the counter, back to the broom. The wedding was theirs. You were the quiet, competent grace around the edge of it, and that's exactly right. And there's a deep contentment in being the unnoticed reason a thing went smoothly. Let's talk about what it's actually like inside, the texture of the daily life between the festivals, because the postcard never shows you the long ordinary middle, and the long ordinary middle is most of any life, including this one. Much of it is quiet to the point of monotony, and I won't pretend otherwise. There are long grey afternoons where almost no one comes, where you've swept and you've restocked and you've practiced your brushwork and there's simply nothing more to do but be present in the cold, quiet space and wait. The shrine in its sleepy season can feel enormous and empty and very, very still. You learn to be alone with it. You learn the particular quality of its silence, the water in the basin, the wind in the high cryptomere, the occasional pilgrim's footsteps on the gravel, the bell when someone does come. You get to know the building the way you get to know a person you live with, its moods in different weather, where the light falls at different hours, which boards creak. The accommodation traditionally was simple. Cold rooms, plain food beyond the consecrated leftovers, an early start every single day without exception, because the gods don't take weekends and neither, therefore, do you. It's a disciplined life, physically demanding in small, relentless ways, the early rising and the kneeling and the standing in the cold and the endless small precise movements. It is not a soft job dressed in pretty clothes, whatever the photographs suggest. The pretty clothes are real, but so are the chilblains. And yet people who've done it speak of it with a particular fondness, a sense of having touched something steady and old and larger than themselves. There's a peace available in a life organised entirely around care and attention and the turning of the year, a peace that's hard to find in faster lives. The repetition that looks like monotony from outside feels, from inside, more like rhythm, like being held in a structure that asks the same gentle things of you every day and slowly shapes you to them. You stop fighting the early mornings. You stop minding the cold. You begin to move through the day the way the dance moves, slowly, attentively, one cared for action after another, and somewhere in there the work stops being work and becomes simply how you are. That's the part no postcard catches. The slow inward settling. The way a life spent tending a quiet sacred place quietly tends you back. You came to serve the gods, and you did, and along the way the serving did something to you, smoothed you, slowed you, taught your hands to be steady and your attention to be whole. Not everyone would want it. But those who fit it deeply, and carry it the rest of their lives like a warmth they can return to. The cat who has settled into your lap during a particularly empty afternoon and is now asleep and faintly snoring has clearly fit this life deeply and has no intention of ever doing anything else. The cat understood the appeal of the shrine immediately and completely on the first day and has never wavered. In some ways the cat grasped the whole thing faster than you did. You should probably resent it. You don't. We should look up at the gods themselves now, the beings on the other end of all this care, because you've been feeding them and dancing for them and serving their wine for a long while now, and we've barely said who they are. So let's sit with that in the quiet. The deities of this religion are not like the single vast law-giving god some traditions place at the centre of everything. They are many, almost beyond counting. An old phrase puts the number at 8 million and means by it simply too many to number. There are great gods, this sun goddess foremost among them, the radiant ancestress we met at the cave, but there are also gods of the rice, gods of the mountains, gods of particular rivers and particular waterfalls, and particular extraordinary old trees. There are gods of the kitchen hearth, and gods of the gate, and gods of the rice field boundary. There are gods who are forces, like wind and growth and the sea, and gods who were once remarkable people, elevated after their lives ended into something venerated. The sacred is not concentrated in one far-off heaven. It is distributed, scattered, local, present, soaked into the actual landscape you can walk through. This is why a shrine sits where it sits. Often a shrine marks a place that was already sacred, a mountain, a spring, a grove, a single astonishing tree wrapped with a thick rope to mark that something dwells in it. The building came to honour a presence that the place already had. The god was in the waterfall before anyone built a roof nearby, and the deity your shrine houses is its own particular being with its own character and its own story and its own festival and its own preferences. Not an off-the-shelf god, but the specific presence of this specific place, which you serve and no other. So when you carry the morning rice to the inner hall, you're not feeding a distant abstraction. You're caring for the particular spirit of this hill, this spring, this grove, the presence that was here before the village and will be here after it, the local sacred made a daily relationship. That's an intimate thing when you sit with it. You and a god of one specific place, keeping each other company across the turning year, you with the rice and the broom, the god with its long silence and its slow, inhuman patience. Neighbours, almost. The oldest neighbour you'll ever have. The rope around the great old tree creaks faintly in the wind. Something is in there. You've stopped questioning it. After long enough in this place, the question simply stops mattering, and the presence simply stays. There were darker corners to the old beliefs, and I'll touch them gently, because they're part of the honest picture, and because a sleepy mind can hold a sad old thing kindly if it's set down softly. The world this religion grew up in was one where misfortune needed explaining, and where the explanation often involved the unseen. Illness, a failed harvest, a run of terrible luck in a household, a person behaving in ways no one could account for. These were frequently understood as the work of spirits, of an offended god, of a restless presence that had not settled, of the lingering ill will of someone no longer living who had left the world unquiet. The miko, in her old medium role, stood right at the centre of all this, because she was the one who could find out what was wrong and what the unseen wanted in order to set it right. So a grieving family whose troubles wouldn't lift might call a medium to learn which presence was disturbing them and how to soothe it. A village struck by a run of misfortune might seek to identify the offended god and the offering that would calm it. This was real spiritual labour with real emotional stakes, the management of grief and fear and the inexplicable, and the women who did it carried a heavy and intimate burden, sitting with people at the worst moments of their lives and giving them, at minimum, an explanation and a path of action when they had neither. Whatever you make of the metaphysics, the human function was profound. They gave the frightened something to do. They gave the grieving a way to keep speaking to the one who was gone. There were harsher beliefs too, ideas about spiritual contamination, about certain states and certain events leaving a person or a place unclean and in need of purification before normal life could resume, about misfortune as something that could attach and spread and had to be ritually cleared away. Some of these ideas placed real and sometimes cruel burdens on people, marking the grieving or the unwell as temporarily unclean, requiring separations and purifications that look hard to modern eyes. I won't dress that up as charming. It wasn't always charming. It was a system for managing a frightening world, and like all such systems, it comforted some and burdened others, often the same people at once. The miko worked inside all of this, the comfort and the burden both, the soothing of grief and the enforcement of purity, the consolation and the constraint. It was a role of real power and real weight in the emotional life of a community, far heavier than a charm counter. The gentle figure in white and red is the calm surface over a very old and very deep well of human fear and longing, and it's worth knowing the well is there, even as you let the calm surface carry you towards sleep. Let's come back up into the light and the specific, and look closely at the small sacred objects you handle every day, because the detail of them is lovely and most people never notice it. And noticing small things is a fine way to drift off. The folded paper streamers first, the white zigzag shapes you see hung everywhere, on the great ropes, on the purification wands, marking sacred boundaries. They are cut and folded from white paper in a particular lightning bolt shape, and they mark the presence or the possibility of the sacred. Where they hang, something is set apart. They're simple, almost humble, just folded paper, and yet they carry enormous symbolic weight, the visible sign that you've crossed from ordinary space into space where the divine might be present. You'll fold a great many of them. They wear and weather and have to be renewed, and there's a correct fold, and your early ones will be, like everything else, enthusiastic before they're elegant. The thick, twisted rope you'll see marking the most sacred spots, around the great tree, across the front of the hall, between two stones standing in the sea at certain famous places. It marks a boundary, the line between the everyday and the holy, and it's often hung with those same paper streamers. It says, plainly, the sacred is on the other side of this. Passing under it means something. Renewing it is a serious undertaking, sometimes a whole festival in itself. The old rope retired and a vast new one woven and raised with great ceremony, because the boundary between worlds is not a thing you let go shabby. The evergreen branch, the sacred tree whose glossy leaves you carry in certain rites and offer at the altar. An everyday plant elevated into a sacred instrument, green and living, offered to the gods as a thing that does not wither the way cut flowers do. A small living emblem of the enduring. The bells you've already met, tiered and bright. The plain unglazed vessels for the offerings, kept apart, used for nothing profane. The wooden plaques people write their wishes on, hung in their fluttering thousands. Each object simple on its own, each one carrying a thread of meaning back through centuries, and all of them passing through your trained, careful hands day after day, until you handle them without thinking, the way you handle your own name. That's the strange grace of long practice. The sacred objects become ordinary to your hands and remain sacred in their meaning, both at once, and you stop seeing the contradiction. A pilgrim watches you fold a paper streamer and sees a sacred act. You see Tuesday, both of you are right. The cat sees a piece of paper that might, with effort, be batted off the table, and is also, in its way, not wrong. The wider economy of the place deserves a clear-eyed look because a shrine is a spiritual institution and also, unavoidably, an institution that has to keep itself standing in the material world, and you live at the join between those two truths. The buildings need maintenance, and traditional wooden buildings need a great deal of it, constantly, against rot and weather and time. The staff need to eat. The festivals cost money to stage. The most famous shrines at the grandest scale undertake an extraordinary practice of periodically rebuilding their most sacred structures entirely from scratch, taking down the old and raising a perfect new copy alongside, then moving the deity across. An act of renewal so expensive and so demanding of skill that it functions as a way of keeping ancient carpentry techniques alive across generations. The rebuilding is profound theology, the sacred kept eternally fresh, never allowed to decay. It is also an enormous bill. So the charms you sell, the fortunes, the blessings performed for a fee, the wedding ceremonies, the wish plaques, the decorative arrows, the brushwork records in the collector's books, all of it is both sincere spiritual offering and the practical income that keeps the lamps lit and the roof sound and the festivals running. The two things are not in conflict, though outsiders sometimes want them to be. A pilgrim makes an offering and receives a charm, and the offering is real devotion, and also real money. And both the devotion and the money are necessary, and nobody at the shrine finds this troubling, because they've never imagined the sacred floating free of the material in the first place. The gods live in the actual landscape. Of course, caring for them costs actual money. You sit at the cash point of all this, quite literally, the place where devotion turns into the means to continue. And there's no cynicism required to hold it. You're not running a scam. You're keeping a 1,000-year-old sacred place alive in a world that runs on money, doing it through 1,000 small honest exchanges, each one a genuine blessing given and a genuine offering received. The student working the New Year counter and the ancient shamaness are joined by this too, the unglamorous truth that the sacred has always had to feed itself, that someone has always had to make the holy place pay for its own roof, and that this has never once made the holiness less real. The cat, who contributes nothing whatsoever to the shrine economy and consumes a non-trivial amount of fish, has somehow never been asked to justify its position. The cat's overhead. The cat is, in accounting terms, a pure loss. And yet no one would dream of running the place without it, which tells you something true about what shrines are actually for underneath all the ledgers. Let's go to a specific shrine for a while, the most sacred one of all, because the abstract idea of a shrine is one thing, and the strangest real example is another, and this one rebuilds itself from nothing every 20 years. Deep in a forest in the Issy region sits the holiest site in the whole religion, the shrine of the sun goddess herself, the radiant ancestress we keep circling back to. And every 2 decades for some 13 centuries the people there have done something that sounds, on first hearing, completely mad. They build an exact copy of the main sacred buildings on an empty plot of land right beside the existing ones, identical in every joint and beam, raised by hand using techniques passed down through unbroken generations of carpenters. Then, in a solemn night ritual, the deity is moved from the old buildings into the new, and the old ones, perfect and only 20 years used, are taken down. The site that held them goes back to bare gravel, waiting empty for the next cycle, 20 years off. Sit with the strangeness of that. Most of the world's sacred architecture is sacred partly because it's old, because the same stones have stood for 1,000 years, and you can touch what your distant ancestors touched. This does the opposite. Here the holiness lives in the renewal itself, in the perpetual freshness, in the act of building rather than the thing built. The shrine is eternal precisely because no single version of it is allowed to last. Permanence through impermanence, the form continues forever, the timber never does. And the practical genius underneath the theology is breathtaking. Because they rebuild every 20 years, the carpentry skills can never be lost. Each generation of master builders trains the next on a real project, hands-on, with the previous version still standing right there to copy. A young carpenter helps build it once, helps build it again 20 years later as a senior hand, and trains the apprentices the 3rd time as an old master. 3 rebuilds in a working life, the knowledge handed mouth to ear and hand to hand, never written into a manual that could be lost, never frozen into a single ancient structure that might one day fall and take the method with it. The shrine isn't a building they maintain, it's a skill they keep alive by performing it, forever. A miko serving at a place like this is part of a machine of continuity, almost too large to feel from inside. You dance and sweep and tend in buildings that are, at any moment, somewhere in their 20-year life, knowing the empty gravel plot beside you is patiently waiting to become the next sacred hall, knowing the one you stand in will one day be bare ground again. It puts your own few years in a humbling frame. The buildings themselves are temporary. You're temporary inside temporary buildings, inside a tradition that has outlasted empires by refusing to let anything in it grow old. The crows, who have no opinion on architectural theology, have simply noted that a rebuild means scaffolding, and scaffolding means excellent new places to sit and judge people from. The crows approve of the 20-year cycle. It refreshes their seating. The approach to a shrine is its own designed experience, a slow, deliberate transition, and since you walk it many times a day, let's walk it properly once, the way a first-time pilgrim does, because the path is doing quiet work on everyone who treads it. It usually begins at a gate, a simple structure of 2 uprights, and a crossbar or 2, often the most recognizable silhouette in the whole tradition, the thing that says, plainly and without words, you're now leaving the ordinary world and entering sacred ground. You pass under it, and the convention is that you do not walk down the exact centre of the path beyond, because the centre is the way of the gods, kept clear for them, and a person of ordinary humility keeps to the side. So already, at the very threshold, your body is being taught something. Make way, you're a guest here, the centre is not yours. Then comes the approach itself, often long, often deliberately so, a path that winds through trees, climbs steps, crosses a stream, takes its time. The length is the point. A shrine doesn't usually let you arrive at the sacred quickly, fresh off the road, with your mind still full of traffic and errands and the argument you had that morning. It makes you walk. The trees close over the path. The sound of the outside world falls away behind you and is replaced by gravel underfoot, wind in the high branches, water somewhere. By the time you reach the basin to rinse your hands, the walk has already half prepared you, drained some of the ordinary out of you, slowed your step to something closer to reverence, without you ever deciding to slow it. The architecture of the approach is a machine for changing your inner state, and it works on people who don't even believe in any of it. You, the miko, walk this path so often it should mean nothing, and for stretches it does. It's just the way to the storeroom and back. But there are mornings, early, alone, with the mist still in the trees and the gravel wet and no one else yet arrived, when the old work of the path catches even you, the person it was never designed for, and you feel the hush of it land, the leaving the world behind, as fresh as if you were a pilgrim seeing it for the first time. The path doesn't know you work here. It does its slow, quiet work on you anyway. And then a tour group arrives, loudly, walking straight down the centre of the path in matching hats, and the spell breaks, and you go gently to redirect them, because the centre is the way of the gods, and somebody has to mention it, and today that somebody is you. There's an animal woven through this religion that we haven't met yet, and it's a grand one, far grander than the cat, though the cat would dispute that, so let's talk about the sacred horse. At many shrines, historically and at some still today, a horse was kept as a sacred animal, a creature the gods were thought to ride, a living offering of the highest kind. To give a shrine a horse was an enormous act of devotion, the gift of something valuable and powerful and alive, and the grandest patrons gave real horses, white ones especially prized, kept and tended on the sacred grounds as mounts fit for a deity. The god was understood to use the horse, to ride it in some unseen way, which meant the animal had to be cared for with extraordinary attention, groomed and fed and stabled as the literal steed of the divine. But real horses are expensive and demanding, and not every shrine or every devotee could give one. And so the tradition did what living traditions do. It found a smaller way to mean the same thing. People began offering images of horses instead of actual horses, paintings of a horse on a wooden plaque, presented to the shrine in place of the living animal. And those wooden plaques, the painted horse substitute for the real gift, slowly became the wish plaques we've already met. The little wooden boards people now buy and write any wish on at all, and hang up in their fluttering thousands. The whole enormous custom of writing your hope on a small wooden tablet descends, directly, from the practice of being unable to afford a whole horse. The word for those plaques even carries the horse inside it still, a fossil of the original meaning. Every student who scribbles a wish to pass an exam onto a little board is, etymologically, offering a horse they couldn't quite manage to bring. As a miko, you'd tend the plaques by the thousand, gathering the full racks, reading despite yourself, the occasional wish that catches your eye as you collect them. Someone hoping a grandmother recovers, someone hoping to be braver, someone every single time hoping desperately and ungrammatically to pass an exam, and if your shrine kept a real sacred horse, you might have the strange honour of helping tend it too, brushing the coat of an animal that belongs technically to a god, an animal that has nowhere to be and nothing to do but exist beautifully as a living offering. There are worse duties. The horse, unlike the cat, at least pretends to be grateful. The cat, for the record, regards the sacred horse with the cold contempt of a creature that knows it is luckier, smaller, and far better positioned near the fish, and has never once had to be ridden by anyone, seen or unseen. We should talk about how you actually find out what a god wants, the divination beyond the cheerful fortune slips, because under the gift shop oracle sits a much older and more serious set of methods, and you live close to all of it. Long before paper slips, the question of the divine will was approached through reading signs in the physical world, and some of the oldest methods are genuinely strange to modern ears. One ancient technique involved heat, and a shoulder bone, an animal's shoulder blade, or later a turtle's shell, held to fire until it cracked, and the pattern of the cracks was read as the answer of the gods, the fishers interpreted by those trained to read them. The unseen wrote its reply in the splitting of bone under heat. A question went in, a crack came out, a reader told you what the crack meant. It sounds primitive put baldly, but think about what it really was. A way of taking a decision no human felt entitled to make, and handing it to a force outside all human bias, removing the choice from the politics of the village and giving it to the fire and the bone. There's a wisdom in that under the strangeness. Sometimes the most peaceful thing is for no person to be the one who decided. Other methods read the world more gently. The behaviour of a sacred animal, the way lots fell, the drawing of a marked stick from a container, the direct ancestor of the fortune slips, used once for solemn choices and only later softened into entertainment. Boiling water and the patterns of steam and droplets, read in certain purification rites, where a miko might dip a bundle of bamboo grass into a cauldron of furiously boiling water and scatter the scalding spray over herself and the watching crowd, the droplets carrying purification, the rite itself a form of divination and blessing at once. That one is a real spectacle, the cauldron roaring, the steam rising, the miko or priest scattering the boiling water in great arcs, the crowd flinching and delighted, and it takes nerve and training to do it without harm, and it looks, frankly, half like sorcery, which is rather the appeal. You might be trained in some of this, depending on your shrine and the century, the safer and more ceremonial forms of it at least. The reading of the unseen's will is the deepest root of your whole role. Older than the dancing, older than the charm counter, the original reason a miko mattered at all. The paper fortune a tourist buys for pocket change is the last gentle leaf on a tree whose roots reach down into cracked bone and boiling cauldrons, and the genuine terror of a community that needed desperately to know what the gods wanted and had no other way to ask. Snow is falling again, thicker now, and the steam from the morning's water rises to meet it, and for a moment the air between is full of both at once, the cold coming down and the warm going up, and nobody reads anything into it because some patterns are just weather. Let's stay with the strange and the spectacular, and talk about the great festivals where things get genuinely wild, because the serene swept gravel image of a shrine hides the fact that some of its biggest days are loud, crowded, physical, and a little bit dangerous. Across the country, the year is studded with festivals where a portable shrine is carried out into the streets, a heavy ornate gilded structure, sometimes enormous, hoisted onto the shoulders of dozens of people and paraded through the town with tremendous noise and effort. The idea is that the deity is invited to leave the main hall, to ride in the portable shrine, and to be carried out among the people, through the streets and fields, blessing the whole community by passing through it. The god goes on tour, and the carrying is not gentle. The bearers deliberately jolt and rock and heave the portable shrine, sometimes violently, because the shaking is thought to please the deity, to rouse its power, to spread its blessing more vigorously. A god, it turns out, enjoys being thrown around, The rougher the ride, the better the year. These festivals are sweat and shouting and crowds and rice wine and exhaustion, about as far from the hushed contemplative postcard as you can get, and they're some of the most beloved days in any community's year. Some of them are famously intense, men packed shoulder to shoulder in the cold competing to grab a sacred object, or vast floats hauled through narrow streets by ropes and sheer collective muscle, or fire carried in great torches, or near-naked bearers in midwinter proving their devotion through cold no sensible person would endure. The line between worship and festival and a really good rowdy party blurs completely, and that blurring is ancient and entirely the point. Joy is an offering too. A community having the time of its life in honour of its god is doing something genuinely sacred, however much rice wine is involved. Your role in all this is once again the quieter sacred work around the loud sacred work. The purifications beforehand, the preparation of the portable shrine, the offerings, the ritual elements, the dancing, the formal rites that bookend the chaos, the careful sacred frame around the joyful mess. You're rarely the one heaving the portable shrine through the streets, but you're all through the ceremony that makes it holy rather than merely fun, the part that turns a town throwing a god around in the cold into an act of devotion 13 centuries deep. And afterward, when the portable shrine comes home and the deity is returned to the main hall, and the streets empty and the rice wine wears off, you're part of the quiet, careful work of putting the sacred back to rest, sweeping up after a god's night out. The two crows spent the entire festival on the highest roof, watching thousands of humans voluntarily carry a very heavy box around in the cold for hours, and reached, as far as anyone can tell, the only sensible conclusion available to a crow, which is that people are fundamentally baffling and best observed from a safe height with low expectations. For every grand shrine with its rebuilt halls and its sacred horse and its dozens of staff, there are thousands upon thousands of tiny ones scattered across the whole country. A small wooden structure beside a rice field, a little shrine tucked into a gap between two city buildings, a stone marker at a mountain pass, a modest roof over a sacred rock at the edge of a village. Most have no one tending them at all in any official sense. A local person might sweep one now and then. An old woman might leave an offering. They simply sit there, year after year, marking a spot the community has held sacred for longer than anyone remembers, asking nothing, staffed by no one, quietly holy. These small shrines tell you something the grand ones can hide, which is how close the sacred sits to ordinary daily life in this tradition. You don't travel to a special holy place to encounter the divine, or you don't have to. The divine is right there beside the field you work, at the corner you turn every day, on the path to the train station, woven into the lived landscape so thoroughly that people pass a dozen sacred spots on an ordinary errand without thinking about it, the way you'd pass a familiar tree. A shopkeeper might keep a tiny shrine on a shelf inside the shop. A household might have one in a high corner of a room, given a fresh offering of rice and water each morning by whoever's up first. A domestic version of the exact thing you do at the great shrine, the same small daily care for an unseen presence, scaled down to a single family and a single shelf. A miko at a large shrine is the visible professional tip of something that is, underneath, almost entirely amateur and domestic and unsupervised, carried by ordinary people in ordinary homes making small daily gestures toward the sacred with no one watching and no one to impress. That's the real body of the religion, not the grand rites you perform, but the old woman who pauses at the roadside shrine on her way home, the family that remembers the rice on the high shelf, the shopkeeper who keeps the small flame. You're trained and costumed and central to the spectacle, but the quiet truth is that the tradition would survive perfectly well without any of the spectacle at all, carried forward on nothing but small private gestures, the way it largely was for much of its history before any of the grandeur was built. There's a humility in realizing that, and a comfort. The thing you serve is bigger than your shrine, older than your role, and held up by countless hands that will never wear the white and red. You're one careful pair of hands among millions. The roadside shrine doesn't need you. It's been fine for centuries. That's not a demotion, it's a relief. Let's go quieter still and sit with the question of silence, because so much of this religion happens in it, and a sleepy mind is the right place to think about quiet. This is not a tradition heavy with sermons. There's no weekly gathering where a leader explains doctrine to rows of seated listeners, no body of teaching you're expected to study and believe, no creed to recite, very little, in fact, of the explaining and arguing and instructing that fills so much of religious life elsewhere. The sacred here is approached mostly through doing and through being present, through the rinse of cold water and the bow and the clap and the swept gravel and the quiet moment standing before the hall rather than through words about any of it. You can be devout your whole life and never once be asked to articulate what you believe, because the belief isn't really the point. The practice is, the attention is, the showing up, clean and quiet, is. This makes it a strange religion to explain to outsiders who often want a doctrine, a list of beliefs, a clear statement of what it all means, and find instead a kind of patient evasion, a shrug, a sense that the meaning isn't in the words and never was. What is the God? It's the presence of this place. What does it want? Cleanliness, attention, care, the offering made well. What happens after this life? The tradition is famously quiet on that, more concerned with the living world and its purity than with mapping what lies beyond, content to leave the largest questions unanswered rather than fill the silence with claims it can't keep. There's an honesty in that reticence that I find moving. It doesn't pretend to know what it doesn't know. It just keeps the place clean and the offerings fresh and lets the great question stay open. For you, the miko, this means your whole working life is conducted largely without explanation. No one sat you down and justified the morning rice in theological terms. You learned the gestures, the bows, the order of things, by doing them under correction until they were yours, and the meaning, such as it is, soaked in slowly through the hands and the repetition rather than arriving through a lecture. You came to understand the sacred not by being told about it, but by tending it day after day, in near silence, until the tending itself became a kind of knowing that has no words and needs none. Ask a long-serving miko what it all means, and she might struggle to say, not because she doesn't know, but because the knowing lives somewhere words don't reach, in the wrists and the swept stones and the cold mornings, in the doing rather than the saying. This shrine in deep winter is one of the quietest places a person can stand. The snow muffles everything. The water in the basin is the loudest thing for a long way. You stand in it and the silence isn't empty, it's full. It's the particular full silence of a place where care has been practiced for 1,000 years. And you don't need anyone to explain it to you, and you'd be hard-pressed to explain it to anyone else. And that's exactly right. There's a darker thread in the history we should touch once more, gently, the matter of what was asked of some sacred women in the deep past, because the soft modern role sits on top of older arrangements that were not always soft, and an honest picture includes them. In certain very old traditions at certain shrines, the woman who served the deity served in a way that asked a great deal of her, sometimes a whole life given over entirely to the god, set apart from ordinary existence, bound by strict rules of purity and seclusion that ordinary people never faced. In the most demanding cases, a young woman, sometimes of high birth, might be selected to serve a particular major shrine as its highest sacred maiden, dedicated to the deity for years at a stretch, required to maintain a level of ritual purity so complete that it cut her off from much of normal life, from her family, from the ordinary freedoms others took for granted. To be chosen was an immense honour, and also, in a real sense, a kind of beautiful confinement, a life narrowed almost to nothing but service, given up to the god whether or not the young woman herself had any say in it, and often she had none. These were not lives anyone today would straightforwardly envy, however prestigious they looked from outside. The constraint was real. The loss of ordinary life was real. A girl set apart this way might spend years in sacred seclusion before being released, by which time the ordinary world had moved on without her, the marriages and friendships and small freedoms of her peers long settled, while she tended a deity and enforced purity. The honour was genuine and the cost was genuine, and they fell, as such things tend to, most heavily on young women who had not chosen them. I won't soften that into something pretty. It was a system that could consume a life in the name of the sacred, and sometimes it did. And yet, holding the modern part-time student against that older dedicated maiden, you can see what the long taming of the role also gave, alongside what it took. The wild, powerful shamaness lost her authority, yes, but the consumed and confined sacred maiden lost her chains. The modern miko serves for a few years, and then walks freely out through the gate into a whole life of her own choosing, owing the god nothing further. The white and red folded away into memory. Something was taken from the role across the centuries. Something was also quietly given back. The history isn't a simple decline from a golden age. It's a tangle of losses and mercies, power surrendered and freedom gained, and the honest reckoning holds all of it at once rather than picking the version that makes the cleanest story. The cat, who has never in its life been confined, dedicated, set apart, or asked to maintain ritual purity, and who would treat any such request with open scorn, has perhaps always understood something the tradition took 1,000 years to arrive at, which is that the sacred and the free are better kept on speaking terms. Let's lift back toward the warm and the human, and talk about the children, properly this time, the days the shrine fills with small ones, because they're among the tenderest working days you'll have, and we only glanced at them before. At certain ages, families bring their children to the shrine to be blessed, dressed in their finest, presented to the deity in a small ceremony of gratitude and hope, a marking of the child's safe passage through the dangerous early years, and a request for protection through the years to come. The very small ones arrive overwhelmed, of course, bundled into stiff formal clothes they don't understand, hauled before strangers in an unfamiliar grand place, and they respond with the full honest range of toddler emotion, some solemn and wide-eyed, some delighted, a reliable proportion utterly outraged and making it known to everyone within range. You spend these days moving among bewildered 3-year-olds and exhausted proud parents, helping, soothing, handing out the small blessed gifts, holding the formal frame steady around a great deal of beautiful chaos. There's an old weight under the sweetness of these days that's easy to miss now. In the centuries when these customs formed, the early years of a child's life were genuinely perilous, and a great many small ones did not pass safely through them, and the blessing was offered against a fear that was real and constant and close. To bring a child to the shrine at a certain age was to give thanks for a survival that could not be taken for granted, to mark a milestone that many families reached grieving rather than celebrating. The bright festival of children in their best clothes carries, underneath, the long shadow of all the families across history who came hoping and did not get to keep what they hoped for. The joy is real. The relief beneath it was for most of history deadly earnest. Knowing that changes how you hold these days, once you've worked enough of them. The outraged toddler in the tiny formal robe, the parent fussing with a collar, the grandmother quietly overcome at the back. You're not just managing a charming photo opportunity. You're standing at one end of a very long line of families who brought their small ones here frightened and hopeful, and you're part of the gesture that says, "This one made it. This one is here. Let's give thanks and ask for more years. It's a privilege to stand in that, even on the loudest, stickiest, most exhausting of the children's days, even when a toddler has just been comprehensively sick on the swept gravel, and the cat has appeared from nowhere to investigate with deeply inappropriate interest. You clean it up, you reset the gravel. A child somewhere is wailing and somewhere else laughing, and both sounds rise into the cold air together, and the parents bow their thanks, and you bow back, and the long line of hopeful families gets one link longer, and the sacred and the mundane share a courtyard, as they always have, as they always will. We should talk about the year's quietest, strangest hinge, the deep midwinter rites that have nothing to do with the New Year crowds, because there's a stretch of the cold season given over to the longest night and the return of the light, and it's some of the oldest feeling in the whole calendar. Around the darkest point of the year, when the nights stretch long and the sun sits low and weak, and the cold settles into the buildings and stays. There are old observances tied to the turning of the light itself, to the moment the days stop shortening and begin, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen again. This is ancient human business, older than any shrine, the deep instinct to mark the bottom of the year and to coax the sun back up out of its long decline. And the sun goddess at the heart of this religion makes the whole thing land with particular force. When the great radiant deity is at her faintest, when her light is thinnest and the world coldest, the rites that call her strength back carry the full weight of that founding myth, the goddess hidden in the cave, the world gone dark, the dance that lured her out. Every midwinter is a small reenactment of that crisis and that rescue. The light retreats. The people call it back. It comes. These are not the crowded festivals. They're quieter, often conducted in deep cold, sometimes through the night, fires kept burning against the dark, the small community of the shrine keeping vigil while the rest of the world sleeps. There's an intimacy to working the deep midwinter rites that the great crowded days never have. Just the staff, the fire, the cold, the long night, the sense of holding something steady through the worst of the dark until the light turns. You'd be up through hours when no visitor comes, tending offerings and flames in the bitter cold, watching the longest night pass slowly over the precinct, and somewhere in the small hours you'd feel the very old thing underneath it. The animal relief of having made it to the bottom of the year and started however faintly back up. There's a kind of courage in these rites that's easy to miss because it's so quiet. To keep a fire burning through the longest, coldest night of the year, to stay awake tending the sacred while the dark presses in hardest, is to make a small, steady stand against the cold and the dark on behalf of everyone who's sleeping warm and unaware. You're keeping watch so the light comes back. You don't really believe, in the modern way, that the sun would fail to return if you let the fire go out. But you tend it through the night anyway, the way your predecessors did for 1,000 winters, because the tending is the point, because someone should be awake and caring at the bottom of the year, because the gesture matters even when the astronomy is handled. The two crows are conspicuously absent on the deep midwinter nights, having sensibly concluded that the longest, coldest night of the year is no time to be a crow, and having retired to wherever crows go to wait out the dark. The cat, by contrast, stays close to the fire all night, a small loyal warmth at your feet, keeping its own vigil against the cold for reasons entirely its own, which is to say the fire is warm and the cat is no fool. Let's follow the rice itself, all the way through the year, because we keep returning to it and it deserves its own slow circle, the whole arc from bare flooded field to the grain on the god's plate, because the shrine year and the rice year are, underneath everything, the same year. It begins in spring, the flooded fields catching the sky, the young rice planted out by hand into the water, and the shrine marks this with rites asking for a good season. blessing the planting, requesting from the rice deity and the field gods a year that yields. In the oldest and most beautiful versions of this, the planting itself becomes ceremony, the first symbolic rice set into a sacred field with music and dance and prescribed gesture, young women planting in rhythm while drums sound, the labour and the worship indistinguishable, the work of feeding the village conducted as an act of devotion because that's exactly what it was. There is no line, in the deep logic of this religion, between growing the food and worshipping the gods. The field is an altar. The harvest is a prayer answered or refused. Through summer the rice grows and the dangers gather, the storms, the pests, the floods, the long anxious wait while the crop that is the whole year's survival stands exposed in the fields, and the shrine marks this too, rites to push back the threats, to calm the storm gods, to protect the standing crop through the perilous growing months. You'd feel the community's tension in these months, the whole village's fortune riding on weather no one can control, the offerings carrying a desperation under their formality, because a failed harvest in the old world didn't mean a hard year. It meant the village going hungry into winter. It meant the kind of season people spoke of in low voices for generations after. And then autumn, the harvest, the crop brought in, and the shrine's whole emotional register changes, from petition to thanks. The first and best of the new rice offered to the gods in gratitude, the great harvest rites, the relief and the abundance, the year's central gamble resolve for one more turn. The new rice on the god's plate in autumn is the same rice you've been carrying to the inner hall all year, but now it's charged with the whole year's anxiety and survival, the answered prayer made visible, the proof that the bargain held one more time. You carry it in with a weight you didn't feel in the abstract offerings of the quiet season. This is the real thing. This is what it was all for. The village ate. The gods are thanked. The wheel turns toward winter and the cycle begins again. To serve a shrine is to live inside this circle whether you farm or not, to feel the year as the rice feels it, the planting and the waiting and the gathering and the thanks, the long agricultural heartbeat that this religion grew out of and never abandoned even as the country built cities and forgot mostly where its food came from. You don't forget. The shrine won't let you. Every grain on the god's plate keeps you remembering. Let's talk about the things people leave behind at a shrine, the whole quiet archaeology of objects that accumulate around a sacred place, because a shrine is, among everything else, a vast slow collection of what people couldn't carry anymore. Beyond the fortune slips tied to the branches and the wish plaques hung in their thousands, people leave all manner of things at a shrine, and tending the slow drift of left objects is part of your work. Small offerings set down before the hall and never reclaimed, tokens brought from far away and surrendered here, things carried to the shrine specifically to be let go of, because a sacred place is, among its other functions, somewhere you can put down what you can't keep and can't quite throw away. Grief left in object form, worn-out charms that protected someone through a hard year, the belongings of those no longer living, brought by families who couldn't bear to discard them but couldn't bear to hold them either, given instead to the care of the gods, set down in the one place where letting go feels less like loss and more like entrusting. You become, in this role, a kind of keeper of other people's surrenders. The objects come in slowly, day by day, and they're handled with care, gathered, often respectfully retired by fire in the appointed rites, the smoke carrying them up and away, along with the spent charms and the bad luck slips. There's a profound and gentle service in this that no one really notices, the shrine functioning as the place where a whole community brings the things too heavy to keep and too meaningful to bin, and where those things are received without question and dealt with respectfully and released. People need somewhere to put what they can't carry. The shrine is that somewhere. You are part of how it receives. Some of what's left is heartbreaking if you let yourself read it, and you learn mostly not to, the way you learn not to dwell on the wishes scribbled on the plaques. A small toy left before the hall. A single worn shoe. Things that clearly meant everything to someone and were brought here precisely because that someone could no longer bear to keep meaning them. You handle these with particular gentleness, ask no questions, make no assumptions, and send them on respectfully when the time comes. And you understand, doing it, that this quiet receiving of grief in object form is one of the oldest and truest things the shrine does. Older maybe than the dancing, older than the charms, as old as the simple human need for somewhere to put a sorrow down. The cat, who finds objects fascinating in an inverse proportion to their meaning, treats the whole solemn drift of left belongings as a personal sculpture garden, and has to be gently dissuaded regularly from carrying off items of deep emotional significance to bat around the storeroom. You've rescued more than one precious surrendered thing from the cat's jaws. The cat does not understand grief. The cat understands that small things move satisfyingly across floors. There's a mercy in that somehow, a creature in the midst of all this sorrow that simply cannot perceive it, going about its bright, uncomplicated business among the relics of other people's worst days. We should sit gently, with the bell and the clap, the small gestures every visitor makes before the hall, because they're the most basic act of the whole religion, and you watch 10,000 people perform them, and there's a quiet beauty in the mechanics that's easy to stop seeing. A visitor approaches the hall. They make a small offering, a coin dropped into the box. They sound the bell or the rope clapper, that bright announcing note we've met before, calling the deity's attention. They bow twice deeply. They clap twice, the sharp sound carrying the same announcing function. Attention, presence, I am here before you. They hold a moment of silent prayer, the wish or the thanks or the simple, wordless standing before, and they bow once more and step back, and the whole thing takes perhaps 30 seconds, and they've done it. The complete fundamental act of approaching a god in this tradition. Simple enough that a small child can learn it, and deep enough that a person can spend a lifetime inside it. There's a theory in the clapping, an old idea that the sharp sound drives off ill influence and calls the pure attention of the deity at once, that the clap does double work, clearing the space and announcing the worshipper in a single gesture. And there's something in the doubleness of it all, the two bows, the two claps, the patterned repetition, that settles a person, that turns a vague intention to pray into a definite bounded act, with a beginning and an end. You don't just stand there hoping the god notices. You sound the bell, you bow, you clap, you've done a thing. The gesture holds your prayer the way a cup holds water, gives it shape and edges and a place to be. You watch this performed endlessly by everyone, the devout and the casual and the tourist fumbling the order, the old people who've done it 10,000 times, and the children being shown by a parent's hands, and after long enough you can read a whole person in how they do it. The brisk practice believer, the nervous first-timer watching others and copying, the one who clearly came with something heavy, who holds the silent moment a beat too long, whose bow has more in it than the gesture requires. You see, across the offering box, a quiet, endless parade of human need brought before the unseen, each person reduced for 30 seconds to the same simple gestures, and yet each one carrying something entirely their own into them. The form is identical, what's poured into it never is. And you, who set up the bell and sweep the gravel they stand on and tend the hall they bow toward, are the invisible support under all those 30-second encounters, the one who keeps the space ready so that anyone at any hour can walk up and sound the bell and be, for half a minute, alone with whatever they brought. That's the whole job, in the end, underneath the dancing and the charms and the festivals. You keep the place ready for the bell to be rung. You make sure that when someone comes with something heavy, The gravel is swept and the hall is clean, and the god is, as far as anyone could arrange, at home. Let's go out, one last time before the leaving begins, to the edge of the precinct where the shrine meets the wild, because so many shrines back onto forest or mountain, and the boundary between the tended sacred and the untamed sacred is its own quiet country. Behind the swept courtyards and the maintained halls, many shrines give way to forest, often old forest, sometimes forest that has stood undisturbed for centuries precisely because it was sacred and therefore never cleared, never logged, never farmed. These sacred groves are among the oldest untouched woodland left in a heavily settled country, preserved not by conservation law, but by reverence, by the simple ancient understanding that the trees behind the shrine belong to the gods and are not to be cut. The shrine, in this sense, is the visible doorway to a wildness it protects, the tended front edge of a holiness that runs back into deep forest where no one sweeps and nothing is maintained, and the sacred is simply the trees themselves standing as they've stood, asking nothing. You'd come to know this boundary intimately, the line where the raked gravel ends and the wild ground begins, where the maintained sacred gives way to the untended sacred. And there's a different feeling back there, past the buildings, in among the old trees, a holiness that has nothing to do with your sweeping or your offerings or any human care at all, a sacred that was here before the shrine and would remain if every building fell, the deep green silence of forest that has been let alone for 1,000 years because something in it was always understood to be divine. You might go back there sometimes, in a quiet hour, just to stand among the old trees and feel the difference, the human sacred you tend, and the wild sacred that tends itself, both real, both old, the shrine, the threshold between them. This is, in a way, the oldest layer of the whole religion showing through, older than any building or rite or role. Before there were shrines, there were sacred places, a particular grove, a particular spring, a particular extraordinary tree, holy simply in themselves, needing no structure and no priest and no miko, the divine encountered directly in the land. Everything you do, all the elaborate tended apparatus of the shrine, grew up around that original simple thing, the holiness of a place. The buildings came to mark it, the rites came to honour it, but the thing itself, the sacred grove behind the shrine, was here first and asks for nothing, and will, in all likelihood, outlast every human addition, standing green and silent and holy long after the last person forgets why. The crows live back there, in the deep trees you realise one day, the two arguing crows that have shadowed your whole service. They nest in the old sacred forest behind the shrine, coming forward each morning to judge you from the roof lines and retreating each night into the wild holiness at the precinct's edge. They've been straddling the two sacreds all along, the tended and the wild, at home in both, belonging fully to neither, which is, when you think about it, exactly what a crow would do, and exactly where a crow would choose to live, on the threshold between the swept and the untouched, keeping an eye on both. And so we come to the end, you and I, at the close of a long day that was really 1,000 years pressed into one, and it's time to let the shrine go quiet and let you go with it. Think of all of it now, gently, as the dark settles in around you for real. The cold room at dawn and the breath hanging in the air, the white over the red tied carefully against the wobble, the broom and the gravel and the leaves that would always come back, the water falling endlessly into the stone basin with its small perfect music, the rice carried to a god you never saw, withdrawn, untouched, shared and eaten and somehow not absurd. The bells in the slow dance, and the very old story of the light coaxed back out of the cave, the fortunes tied in white drifts to the branches, the fire taking a year of sorrow up into the night, the crush of 1,000,000 hopes passing through your cold hands at the turning of the year, the wedding wine poured with steady hands trained over 1,000 mornings, the long quiet afternoons that taught you the silence of the place until the place had quietly taught you back. And all the women behind you, stretching back into the firelight, nameless and uncountable, who lived this same shape of a life and handed it forward so it could reach you, and the women ahead of you, not yet born, will take it up when you set it down. The wandering mediums who lost their open place in the world and endured anyway, in softened form, in white and red, sweeping gravel into the modern age. The whole long, patient line of careful hands. You were one of them for a while. That was enough. That was always going to be enough. The lanterns are going out now, one by one, around the precinct. The snow has settled over the swept stones and made everything soft and even and still. Somewhere up in the dark cryptomeria, the two arguing crows have finally mercifully gone to sleep, and the cat has curled into the warmest spot it could find and become a small breathing circle of contentment, asking nothing of the night, certain the fish will be there in the morning, certain the warm-handed beings will return, certain, in its small wise way, that the world is fundamentally a place that continues. Let your shoulders down from where they've been holding. The day is finished. The gods are fed, the gravel is swept, the fire has carried the old year away, and there's nothing left for you to tend tonight but your own quiet drift toward morning. The shrine has stood for 1,000 years. It will keep watch while you rest. Sleep well. Good night.